The vibration of a GE Evolution Series locomotive at idle is not a sound. It is a frequency that rewrites the density of your bones. It is a 4-stroke, 12-cylinder heartbeat displacing 4,400 horsepower. And for the last 20 years, it has been the only lullaby I've ever been able to sleep to. I sat in the engineer's seat of Lead Unit 8404, boots resting on the heater vent, watching the digital readout of the brake pipe pressure hold steady at 90 pounds per square inch. Outside the reinforced glass of the cab, the world was a void. We were parked inside Shed 47, one of the concrete galleries that protect the Union Pacific track over Donner Pass. To the left was a concrete wall scarred by decades of diesel soot. To the right, through the concrete pillars, was a wall of white. The snow was not falling. It was being driven horizontally by 60-mile-per-hour gusts, packing the gaps between the shed's columns like wet concrete. "Signal still red over red," Davila said. He was pacing the small floor space between the conductor's desk and the nose door, his safety vest rustling like dry leaves. "Dispatch has not said a word in 40 minutes, Miller. This is not just a switch failure." I did not look at him. I looked at the flow meter. We were burning 3 gallons of diesel an hour at low idle. We had roughly 2,000 gallons in the belly tank. Do the math. "Sit down, kid. You're using up the oxygen." "I'm serious," Davila snapped, stopping his pacing to tap the glass of the side window. "Did you hear that last transmission from Truckee? The yardmaster sounded like he was choking. Then nothing but static, and before that, the chatter about the highway being closed? Not by Caltrans, but by people." I reached forward and tapped the glass of the display screen, cycling through the engine diagnostics. Oil pressure, normal. Water temperature, 180 degrees. The machine was fine. The machine was the only thing that mattered. "Weather brings down repeaters, Davila. Heavy snow loads interfere with radio waves. We sit tight. We hold the brakes. We wait for the green." "I'm not waiting," he said. He grabbed his grip, the yellow canvas bag every railroader carries, and slung it over his shoulder. "I'm walking back to the access road at the east portal. My truck is parked at the maintenance lot. I'm going to check on my wife." I finally turned the chair to face him. The cab was dimly lit by the instrument cluster, casting his face in a sickly green glow. He looked young. Too young to understand that when the mountain wants to kill you, the safest place is inside 200 tons of American steel. "The east portal is 2 miles back," I said, my voice flat. "The snowdrift between the pillars is 5 feet deep and unstable. The wind chill is 30 below. You walk out of this shed. You do not make it to the truck. You become a statue until the spring thaw." "Better than sitting here in the dark waiting to starve," he said, his hand already on the heavy latch of the rear door. "We have water. We have the heater. We have a roof that can take an avalanche. Sit down." He did not listen. He cranked the handle. The door swung open, and the sound of the world invaded our sanctuary. It was not a howl. It was a physical blow, a screaming roar of wind that instantly sucked the heat out of the cab. Snow swirled in, hitting the hot metal of the engine console and hissing as it melted. "I'll radio you when I get signal," he shouted over the gale, pulling his collar up. "Davila!" I yelled, standing up. He was already gone. I watched his headlamp bobbing in the darkness of the tunnel, moving away from the engine, stepping over the icy ties. He did not look back. I waited 10 seconds, watching the darkness swallow him. Then I stepped to the door, grabbed the cold steel handle, and slammed it shut. I threw the deadbolt. Then I engaged the secondary latch. The silence returned, heavy and mechanical,
underpinned by the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the air compressor cycling on the rear deck. I was alone. The first hour was routine. I did what I was paid to do. I monitored the gauges. I checked the independent brake handle, ensuring it was fully applied. We were sitting on a 1.5% grade inside the shed.
If the air bled off and the handbrakes were not set on the cars behind me, gravity would eventually win. I had 3 locomotives in this consist, my lead unit, and 2 trailing units working as slaves. Combined, they anchored 6,000 feet of lumber, coiled steel, and consumer electronics to the side of the mountain. I picked up the handset of the radio and keyed the mic. "Dispatch, this is UP 8404. Location, Shed 47. Signal is still red. Conductor has vacated the cab. Requesting orders. Over." Static. Not the clean hiss of an empty channel, but a dirty, crackling noise. Layers of voices stepping over each other, distant and distorted. I spun the dial, scanning the frequencies. Channel 14, road channel. Biting him. Jesus Christ, he's biting him. Channel 66, yard. Gate is breached. Do not stop the train. I repeat, do not stop. Channel 9, emergency. A looped, automated voice, barely audible. Shelter in place. Civil authority has issued. I turned the volume down. I did not need to hear the panic. I needed to know the status of the track. If the yard at Roseville was gone and the yard at Sparks was gone, then the line was dead. A dead line meant I was not an engineer anymore. I was a squatter in a very expensive metal box. I stood up and moved to the nose door, the thick steel door that leads to the short hood at the front of the locomotive. I opened it and stepped down into the nose compartment. It smelled of freezing metal and the chemical tang of the toilet chemical. This was where the spare knuckles and air hoses were stored. I rummaged through the toolkit until my hand closed around the cold steel of a 24-inch pipe wrench. Back in the cab, I looked at the rear door, the one Davila had left through. It had a window, standard safety glass. Strong, but not invincible. If someone or something climbed the rear ladder from the walkway, they would see me. I dug into my grip and pulled out a roll of duct tape, the heavy-duty, 100-mile-an-hour stuff we used for temporary hose repairs. I tore off strips and layered them over the window glass, cross-hatching until the view outside was nothing but a silver square. If I could not see them, they could not see me. I checked the front windows. They were bullet-resistant glazing, designed to stop cinder blocks dropped from overpasses. They would hold. The side windows were the weak points. They slid open. I took the pipe wrench and wedged it into the track of the engineer's side window, jamming it tight against the frame. I did the same on the conductor's side with a pry bar I found under the seat. Secure. My stomach rumbled. I looked at the cooler Davila had left behind. He had panicked and left his lunch. I opened it. 2 ham sandwiches, a bag of chips, 3 bottles of water, and a thermos of coffee. I had my own supply. Beef jerky, a liter of soda, and an apple. Not a feast, but enough for 3 days if I rationed. I sat back in the chair and put my feet up. The alerter system, the dead man's switch that beeps every 60 seconds to make sure the engineer has not had a heart attack, was going to be a problem. I could not sleep if I had to hit a button every minute. I opened the electrical cabinet behind the conductor's seat. The high-voltage warning stickers were peeling at the corners. I knew this panel better than I knew my own house. I found the breaker labeled Alert, Safe, and flipped it. A yellow light on the dash blinked fault, but the countdown timer died. Now the cab was truly quiet, save for the engine. Night fell, or at least,
The gray light filtering through the snow shed columns turned to pitch black. The temperature in the cab began to drop. The floor heaters in these units are notorious garbage, electric coils that barely take the edge off. The real heat comes from the diesel engine itself, radiating through the firewall. But at idle, it was not enough to combat a Sierra's blizzard. I needed to act. The cold would kill me faster than hunger. I pulled on my heavy coat, Carhartt, grease-stained and stiff with age. I put on my gloves. I needed to inspect the trailing units. If I was going to survive here, I needed to know if the slave locomotives were online. If they died, their air compressors died.
If the air compressors died, the brakes would eventually bleed off. If the brakes bled off, the train would roll backward down the mountain, derail on a curve, and send me tumbling into the canyon. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight and a fusee, railroad flare. I unlocked the rear door and stepped out onto the walkway. The cold hit me like a physical assault. The wind inside the tunnel was channeled, accelerating through the concrete tube. It screamed over the radiator wings of the locomotive. I clipped my safety line to the railing, a habit I could not break even at the end of the world, and began to walk backward toward the second unit. The walkway was slick with ice. Snow had blown in through the shed columns and formed drifts against the engine housing. I crunched through it, the beam of my flashlight cutting a cone through the swirling white dust. I reached the gap between the lead unit and the second unit. The electrical umbilical cables were coated in ice. The air hoses were stiff. I stepped across the gap, the couplers groaning beneath my boots as the train settled slightly against the grade. I opened the door to the second unit. It was an older EMD SD-70. The cab was dark, cold, and empty. The engine was running, but barely. The low idle light was flashing on the control stand. It was trying to save fuel. "Not tonight," I muttered. I sat in the cold seat and navigated the computer menu. I found the auto engine start-stop protocol and disabled it. Then I bumped the throttle to notch 1. The engine RPMs flared, the deep bass thrum rising in pitch. The turbocharger whined. Heat began to pour from the vents. I did the same for the third unit. Now I had 3 massive generators running at high idle. The fuel consumption would jump, but the heat would keep the batteries charged, the oil fluid, and the air tanks full. More importantly, the noise would fill the tunnel. A wall of sound to drown out whatever was happening in the cities below. I was walking back to the lead unit when I saw it. About 50 yards back, near the fourth car, a boxcar loaded with lumber. Something was moving in the shadows of the shed pillars. I froze, killing my flashlight. The darkness was absolute, save for the faint ambient light reflecting off the snow outside. I squinted. A shape. Humanoid, but moving wrong. Jerky. It stumbled into a concrete pillar, bounced off, and kept moving toward the tracks. It was not walking with purpose. It was shuffling, dragging a leg. Then another shape appeared behind it. And another. They were not coming from the train. They were coming from the access vents in the tunnel wall, the escape hatches from maintenance crews. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm against the steady beat of the diesels. I was unarmed. Union Pacific has a strict no-weapons policy. A pipe wrench is a tool, not a weapon, until you need it to be. But against 3? Against 10. I unclipped my safety line and scrambled back toward the lead unit. My boot slipped on the icy grating. I banged my shin against a traction motor blower housing, but did not feel the pain. I reached the rear door of my cab, threw it open, and dove inside. I slammed it shut and locked the deadbolt.
I re-engaged the secondary latch. Then, for good measure, I grabbed the conductor's chair, a heavy, bolted-down swivel seat, and realized I could not move it. Panic was rising, cold and sharp. I forced it down. Think. Mechanics. Leverage. I grabbed the emergency chain, a length of heavy steel chain used for securing bad order cars. I wrapped it around the door handle and looped it around the heavy steel stanchion of the conductor's desk. I pulled it tight and padlocked it. If they wanted in, they would have to tear the door off its hinges or cut through the steel. I moved to the side window, the one I had jammed with the pipe wrench. I peeled back the edge of the duct tape just enough to make a peephole. I waited. 5 minutes passed. The sound of the engines at Notch 1 was loud, a steady roar. Then, a face pressed against the glass of the rear door. It was illuminated by the faint glow of the numberboard lights reflecting off the tunnel walls. The skin was gray, slack. The eyes were clouded, milky white cataracts where the pupils should be.
It opened its mouth, and I saw teeth broken to jagged shards. It did not scream. It just banged its forehead against the safety glass. Thud, thud, thud. Then a hand slapped the glass. The fingers were black with frostbite, the nails gone. It clawed at the steel, uselessly. I stepped back, breathing hard. The duct tape hid me, but the noise of the engine drew them. They were like moths to a flame. There were more thuds now, metal on metal. They were swarming the walkway. I could hear them stumbling, slipping on the ice, falling against the handrails. I looked at the throttle. If I released the brakes and notched up to 8, I could grind them into paste against the tunnel walls. I could push the snow aside and barrel down the mountain. But the signals were red. The training is deep. You do not run a red signal. A red signal means a block is occupied. If I ran it, I might hit a stalled train in the dark. A collision at this weight, on this grade, would be a thermonuclear event. We would accordion into a mess of twisted steel and fire. I am not moving, I whispered to the empty cab. I turned off all the interior lights. The cab plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the faint green phosphorescence of the pressure gauges. Brake cylinder, 72 psi. Main reservoir, 130 psi. Brake pipe, 90 psi. I sat on the floor, my back against the electrical cabinet, the pipe wrench across my lap. The banging on the door continued, a dull, rhythmic drumming. It was not aggressive yet. It was curious, persistent. I checked my watch. 19 hours. Davila was dead. He had to be. If he had made it to the drift, the cold took him. If he stayed in the tunnel, these things took him. I was the captain of the ship now, and the ship was sinking in a sea of snow and monsters. I closed my eyes and listened to the machine. I visualized the pistons firing, the crankshaft turning, the alternator spinning. I focused on the mechanical truth of the universe. Steel is harder than flesh. Diesel burns. Cold preserves. I needed a plan for the morning. I needed to secure the perimeter better than a length of chain. I needed to figure out how to get water when my 3 bottles ran out. I needed to figure out if I could tap the main generator to run a hot plate. But for tonight, I just had to hold the line. The banging on the door stopped after an hour. The cold had likely frozen them in place, or they had lost interest. But I did not move. I sat in the green glow, listening to the wind scream outside the shed and the engine purr inside. Shed 47,
I whispered into the dark. Population 1. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a stick of gum. I unwrapped it slowly, folded the foil into a tiny square, and put it in the ashtray. Routine. Order. I was not a survivor yet.
I was just an employee working overtime on the longest shift of my life. I checked the brakes again. 90 psi. Steady. Dawn inside the snow shed was a theoretical concept. The darkness did not lift. It just changed texture, shifting from a solid black void to a bruised, dirty gray that filtered through the ventilation gaps between the concrete pillars. I woke up because the vibration changed. The engine RPM of the lead unit had dipped slightly, a momentary stutter in the fuel injection timing that a layman would not hear, but which hit my ear like a gunshot. I sat up, my neck screaming in protest. The cab was freezing. My breath plumed in the air, a thick white fog that settled on the instrument panel. I checked the overhead console. The digital thermometer read 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cab, the floor heater was humming, blowing a tepid stream of air that died before it reached my knees. I rubbed my face, feeling the grit of stubble and the dry, papery friction of dehydration. My tongue felt like a strip of Velcro. I looked at the rear door. The chain I had lashed around the handle was taut. The duct tape over the window remained undisturbed. I stood up, joints popping, and moved to the peephole. The walkway outside was empty of movement. The shapes from last night were gone. I pressed my eye closer to the glass. Down near the grate, buried under a fresh drift of snow that had blown through the seals, I saw a lump of gray fabric. A boot stuck out at an unnatural angle. One of them had frozen solid right there on the deck. The cold was a weapon. It kept the enemy sluggish, but it was currently winning the war against my body. I turned back to the console. The water bottles were the immediate crisis. I had 2 left, maybe 30 ounces of fluid. A human male in stress conditions needs 60 ounces a day minimum to maintain cognitive function. If I started making mistakes, I was dead. I had thousands of gallons of water in the radiator system of the locomotive, but it was poisoned, a chemical cocktail of nitrates, borates, and silicates designed to keep the massive EMD 710 engine from corroding. Drinking that would shut down my kidneys before I finished swallowing. But outside, just beyond the steel skin of this machine, were tons of clean, frozen water. I needed a system. I opened the nose door and stepped into the short hood compartment. It was a chaotic storage locker, spare air hoses, bags of sand for traction, a rusty knuckles, and the chemical toilet that smelled of blue disinfectant and despair. I ignored the toilet and went for the toolkit. Standard issue Union Pacific maintenance kit. I dumped it onto the steel floor. A 24-inch pipe wrench, a set of open-ended wrenches, standard, not metric, this was American iron. A ball-peen hammer, a roll of electrical tape, a handful of zip ties, a multimeter, fluke, thank God. And a utility knife with 2 spare blades. It was not a fabrication shop, but it was enough for someone who knew how the machine was plumbed. I dragged the heavy steel trash bin from the nose compartment into the cab. It was a simple galvanized cylinder, dented and stained, but watertight. This would be my reservoir. Now I needed heat. The electric sidewall heaters were useless for boiling water. They were low-wattage resistance strips designed to keep feet from freezing, not to cook. I looked at the hot plate Davila had stowed in his grip, a cheap plastic thing that plugged into the 74-volt DC outlet. It would take an hour to melt a cup of snow. Too slow. I needed the heart of the beast. The locomotive's prime mover, the V12 diesel engine behind the rear wall,
operates at a coolant temperature of roughly 180 degrees Fahrenheit when under load. Even at idle, the water jacket temperature sits around 160. That coolant is pumped through the engine block, into the massive radiators in the rear wings, and into the cab heater core. I knelt on the floor on the conductor's side and pried up the access panel. Beneath the diamond plate decking, amidst a nest of electrical conduits and air lines, ran two thick rubber hoses. One supply, one return. They carried the hot engine coolant to the fan-forced heater under the desk. If I could tap that heat, I could melt snow as fast as I could shovel it. I spent the next hour mapping the build in my head.
I could not just cut the hose and dump coolant into the bucket. That would poison the water. I needed a heat exchanger, a closed loop. I needed a coil of conductive metal to carry the hot coolant through the snow, melting it by contact, without mixing the fluids. I searched the nose again. No copper pipe. No spare tubing. Then I looked at the windshield wipers. These were not the flimsy blades you see on a sedan. These were heavy-duty pneumatic wipers, driven by compressed air. The air was delivered through small-diameter stainless steel tubing running along the top of the windshield frame. It was not copper, but thin-wall stainless steel transfers heat reasonably well. And I did not need the wipers. I was not driving anywhere. I grabbed the open-ended wrench and climbed onto the console. It took 10 minutes of swearing and slipping to disconnect the fittings. The tubing was clamped to the frame every 6 inches. I used the pry bar to pop the clips. When I pulled the lines free, I had 2 sections of tubing, each about 4 feet long. It was not enough for a proper coil. I sat back in the captain's chair, staring at the ceiling, turning the steel tube in my hands. I needed more surface area. Then I remembered the oil cooler on the air compressor in the rear unit. The second locomotive, the SD-70, had a different compressor setup. Some of the older auxiliary lines were copper. I had to go back out. The thought made my stomach tighten. Leaving the sealed cab meant exposing myself to the walkway, the cold, and the things. But thirst was a math problem I could not ignore. I prepped like I was going on a spacewalk. I zipped my Carhartt to the chin. I put on a second pair of socks. I took the pipe wrench in my right hand and the flashlight in my left. I unlocked the chain. The wind hit me instantly, but I kept my head down. I moved fast. I stepped over the frozen body on the walkway without looking at its face. I crossed the gap to the second unit, the couplings groaning under my boots. Inside the second unit, the heat was better. I had left the engine running at a higher idle. I moved to the compressor compartment located behind the electrical cabinet. It was tight, loud, and smelled of hot oil. There it was, the governor line. A beautiful, spiraled length of quarter-inch copper tubing connecting the main reservoir air to the compressor governor. It was about 6 feet long if straightened. I did not have a tubing cutter. I used the side cutters on my Leatherman to crimp the copper, then flexed it back and forth until metal fatigue snapped it. It was a jagged cut, but I could file it later. I took the whole line. I made it back to the lead unit without incident. The cold had driven everything into hibernation. Now, the fabrication began. I cleared the conductor's desk to use as a workbench. The goal? Create an immersion heater. First, I took the copper tubing and carefully straightened it, avoiding kinks that would throttle the flow. Then, using the galvanized trash bin as a form, I bent the copper into a tight spiral, about 8 inches in diameter. I made 4 loops. This was my radiator. Next, I had to splice this coil into the locomotive's heater system. I shut off the isolation valves for the cab heater, 2 yellow ball valves located in the floor well. This prevented scalding coolant from spraying everywhere when I cut the line.
I took the utility knife and sliced through the thick black rubber of the heater supply hose. A cup of green glycol bled out onto the floor. I caught most of it with a rag. Now came the hard part, the connection. The rubber hose had an internal diameter of 1 inch. My copper tube was 1/4 inch. I needed a reducer. I did not have one. I looked at the refuse pile of my scavenged kit. I picked up a plastic water bottle. The cap. The plastic was high-density polyethylene, HDPE. It melts, but it's tough. No, that would not hold pressure. I needed a mechanical seal. I went to the nose again and dug through the junk drawer, a tray of random bolts and fittings left by previous crews. I found a treasure, a handful of brass air brake ferrules and a splice connector for a 1/2 inch airline. It was not a perfect match. I had to improvise a step-down bushing. I took a scrap of the heavy rubber hose I had just cut.
I sliced a 2-inch section. Then I sliced a thinner strip from an old floor mat. I wrapped the copper tube end in the floor mat rubber, increasing its diameter until it was snug inside the heater hose. Then I used hose clamps, thank God for hose clamps, to crank the rubber heater hose down onto my makeshift bushing. I tightened the screw until the rubber bulged and the metal groaned. It had to hold about 30 psi of pressure. I repeated the process for the return line, connecting the other end of the copper coil back into the system. The result was ugly. A loop of copper tubing hung suspended in the center of the trash bin, connected to the locomotive's vanes by bulging, taped-up rubber arteries. Now, the test. I placed the trash bin securely between the conductor's seat and the heater vent. I used duct tape to secure the hoses to the wall so they would not kink. I reached down into the floor well and grabbed the yellow handle of the isolation valve. "Hold together," I whispered. I turned the valve. Thump. The hoses jumped as the pump pressure hit the restriction. A hiss of air escaped. Then, I heard the fluid rushing. I watched the connection points. A bead of green liquid formed at the supply splice. It grew into a droplet. I grabbed the screwdriver and cranked the hose clamp another 1/2 turn. My knuckles turned white. The rubber squeaked. The droplet fell, but no second droplet formed. The seal held. I touched the copper coil. It was instantly hot. Too hot to hold. 160 degrees of thermal transfer. I grabbed the empty water bottles and the spare bucket I'd found. I unlocked the side window, the one I jammed with the pry bar. I slid it open just 6 inches. The wind howled through the gap, bringing a spray of snow. I used a clipboard to scoop snow from the drift that had piled up on the walkway railing, dumping it into the trash bin. Scoop after scoop. Powder, ice chunks, dirty slush. I filled the bin to the brim, burying the copper coil. Then I closed the window and waited. Physics took over. The second law of thermodynamics dictates that heat moves to cold. The infinite thermal mass of the locomotive's 4,000-gallon cooling system assaulted the snow. A hissing sound rose from the bin. The snow began to slump. Steam curled up, smelling faintly of ozone and wet wool. In 10 minutes, the bin was half full of gray, slushy water. In 20 minutes, the snow was gone, replaced by a steaming bath of hot water. I dipped a plastic cup into the water. It was cloudy with dust from the tunnel, but it was hot. I raised it to my lips. It tasted like metal and dust, but it was fresh. I drank it. Then I drank another. I felt the heat spread through my chest, untying the knots in my stomach. I had a well. As long as the diesel lasted, I had water. But the build was not done.
The heat from the bin was humidifying the cab.
Condensation was already forming on the cold steel walls. If I let the cab get damp, mold would start, and my clothes would lose their insulation value. I needed to ventilate, but I could not open a window without losing all the heat I just generated. I looked at the overhead vent, a small, circular intake usually used for fresh air. It was jammed shut with rust. I took the handle of the ball-peen hammer and beat the lever until the rust shattered and the vent popped open. A draft of freezing air shot down. I took a piece of cardboard from a fusee case and duct-taped it into a tube. I ran the tube from the vent down toward the floor, directing the cold, fresh air to the base of the heater. Then, I looked at the trash bin. I needed a lid to stop the humidity. I used the plastic casing of the conductor's desk lamp, ripping the shade off and flattening it. I cut a slot for the hoses and placed it over the bin. Now, I had a radiator. The copper coil heated the water in the bin. The water heated the steel of the bin. The bin radiated dry heat into the cab. I had turned a water heater into a passive radiator that stayed hot long after the electric blower cycled off. I sat back in the engineer's chair, exhausted. My hands were covered in grease and glycol cuts. My back ached. But the cab was warming up. The temperature gauge on the console ticked up. 32 degrees. 35. 40. I took my boots off for the first time in 24 hours. My socks were damp with sweat. I hung them on the new radiator bin to dry. I picked up the manifest from the floor. Now that I was not dying of thirst, I could plan. Car 1-12, lumber, Doug fir. Car 13-15, steel coil. Car 16, tanker, UN 1203, gasoline. Car 17, boxcar, general freight. Gasoline. That was useful, but dangerous. Lumber meant construction material. But it was Car 18 that caught my eye. Car 18. Reefer. Refrigerated boxcar. Contents: perishable. Poultry. Frozen chicken. Thousands of pounds of it. If the reefer unit had run out of fuel, the meat would spoil eventually. But in this cold, the whole train was a freezer. I had food. But Car 18 was nearly 1,000 feet back. In the dark. In the tunnel. I looked at the chain on the door. The silence of the shed was heavier now. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that felt pregnant with threat. I had water. I had heat. I had a fortress. But a fortress is also a prison. I reached for the radio handset again, almost out of habit. I did not key the mic. I just listened to the static. And then I heard it. Not a voice. A rhythmic clicking. Click, click. Pause. Click, click. It was coming from the emergency channel. It was not random interference. It was a pattern. I grabbed a pencil and the back of a movement form. Click. Dot. Click, click, click. Dash. Click. Dot. Click. Dot. L. I listened for 10 minutes, transcribing the faint signal that was cutting through the atmospheric noise. It repeated every 2 minutes. Loop. South. Loop south clear, I whispered. The Tehachapi Loop? That was hundreds of miles south. Or was it a local designation? The loop could refer to the balloon track at Truckee. If the Truckee Loop was clear, that meant the yard might be clear. Truckee was 12 miles east, downhill. I looked at the brake pipe pressure, 90 psi. I looked at the throttle. I had built a life support system in a steel box. I had water and heat.
I could stay here for weeks. But someone was broadcasting. Someone was alive at the bottom of the hill. I looked at the Snow Melter 9000 bubbling in the trash can. It was a masterpiece of desperate plumbing. It anchored me here. Leaving it meant leaving the only sure thing I had. I tore the paper with the code on it and shoved it into my pocket. Not today. Today was for stabilizing. Tomorrow, I would figure out if the signal was a lifeline or a trap. I leaned back, closing my eyes, listening to the water bubble. Glug, glug. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. The machine was dying, and I heard it before I saw it. It was not a sudden silence. A catastrophic failure, a thrown rod, or a seized bearing is violent and immediate. This was different. This was a slow, suffocating asthma.
The GE Evolution Series V12, usually a rhythmic baritone thrum that vibrated the fillings in my teeth, had developed a hiccup, a shallow, hunting idle. The RPMs would dip to 200, shudder as the governor fought to compensate, surge to 350 with a belch of black smoke, and then settle back into a labored, wheezing rhythm. I sat up in the engineer's seat, the heavy wool blanket falling off my shoulders. The cab temperature had dropped. My Snow Melter 9000 was still bubbling, the copper coils radiating heat, but the air coming from the floor vents was tepid. I wiped the condensation from the side window. The problem with a snow shed is that it protects the track, but it traps the exhaust. And when the wind blows from the wrong quadrant, straight into the east portal, like it was doing now, it packs the snow against the ventilation gaps between the concrete pillars. The locomotive was suffocating. The massive air intakes, located high on the car body behind the cab, were likely plastered with wet, heavy snow. If the engine could not breathe, the fuel-to-air mixture would run rich. Unburned diesel would wash the cylinder walls, diluting the oil. The turbocharger would surge. Eventually, the computer would trigger a low-air shutdown to save the block. If the engine shut down, the batteries would die in 4 hours. The heater would die instantly. I would follow shortly after. I grabbed the flashlight and the pipe wrench. My stomach twisted, a sharp, hollow cramp. I had not eaten a real meal in 48 hours. The beef jerky was gone. The apple was a memory. The hydration from the snow melter kept my blood pumping, but my muscles were running on fumes. I felt lightheaded when I stood up, the cabin tilting slightly. "Fix the engine first," I muttered, my voice raspy. "Eat second." I needed to clear the intakes. That meant going outside. That meant climbing the roof. I prepped my gear. I took the last road flare, fusee, from the rack. I checked the seal on my jacket. I tightened my bootlaces until my feet throbbed. Loose boots meant rolled ankles on icy grating. I unlocked the heavy chain on the rear door. The noise hit me the moment I cracked the seal. The shed was an echo chamber. The locomotive was not just idling. It was coughing, a wet, heavy sound that bounced off the concrete walls. Ka-chung! Wheeze. Ka-chung! I stepped onto the walkway. The air was thick with blue-gray smoke. The unburned diesel fumes were eye-watering. Visibility was less than 10 feet. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting a solid cone through the smog. I moved aft, keeping one hand on the safety rail. The metal was coated in a 1/4 inch of rime ice. Under the ice, a layer of oil residue made the footing treacherous. I reached the ladder leading to the roof of the engine compartment. That's when I smelled it. Beneath the sharp tang of diesel and the metallic scent of ozone, rot. It was a sweet, cloying smell, like a dumpster behind a butcher shop in August. It did not belong in a frozen tunnel. I stopped, hand on the ladder rung, and swept the light beam down toward the ground. The ballast rock between the rails and the shed wall was a mess of shadows. Something moved. Not the wind. A shape detached itself from the gloom of the concrete pillars. Then another. They were sluggish, their movements disjointed, like marionettes with tangled strings. The cold had stiffened their joints, but the heat and the noise of the dying engine had drawn them out of the tunnel depths. They were clustered near the fuel tank, pressing their bodies against the warm steel, trying to leach the heat from the diesel reservoirs. There were maybe 20 of them. One of them looked up. The eyes were white marbles in a face of frost-bitten gray leather. It opened its mouth and let out a sound that was not a scream, but a dry, clicking hiss. They had found the heat source. Now they were looking for the meat. I killed the light. Darkness swallowed the walkway. I had a choice. Retreat to the cab and lock the door? No. The engine would die in 20 minutes. If I locked myself in, I was just sealing my own coffin. I had to clear those intakes. I started to climb. The roof of a locomotive is a dangerous place on a sunny day in the yard. In a blizzard, inside a smoke-filled tunnel, above a horde of frozen dead. It's a suicide run. The dynamic brake blisters stood like islands in a sea of curved steel. I crawled on hands and knees, staying low to avoid the worst of the wind cutting through the shed pillars. I reached the central air intake screens. There were massive steel grills, 4 feet square, positioned on the angled roofline. They were gone. Not gone, but buried. A solid drift of snow had blown through a collapsed section of the shed roof and plastered the entire side of the locomotive. The snow had frozen into a hard, wind-packed carapace. The engine was trying to suck air through a solid wall of ice. I grabbed the pipe wrench. I needed to shatter the crust. I swung. Clang! The impact vibrated up my arms, shocking my cold muscles. A spiderweb of cracks appeared in the ice. I swung again. Crack! A chunk of ice fell away, revealing the mesh screen. A desperate suck of air hissed into the manifold. The engine note changed instantly, the RPMs flaring as oxygen hit the cylinders. That's it, I grunted, raising the wrench for a third strike. Then the locomotive shuddered. Not from the engine, from an impact below. I crawled to the edge of the roof and peered over the side. The blue smoke obscured the details, but I could hear them. They were climbing. They were not using the ladders. They were piling up. A mound of bodies, pressing against the walkway railing, stepping on each other's shoulders. The ones at the bottom were being crushed, but they formed a ramp for the ones behind. A hand slapped the walkway grating. Then a head appeared. It was wearing a torn conductor's vest. Davila. His jaw was hanging loose, held on by a strip of skin. His eyes were gone, pecked out by birds or lost to the freeze. But he was climbing with a mechanical, mindless determination. He pulled himself over the rail, his frozen fingers locking onto the stanchions like vice grips. I scrambled back toward the center of the roof. I had cleared one intake. It was not enough. The engine was still hunting, starving. I needed to clear the other side. But the other side was facing the shed wall. The gap was only 2 feet wide. If I went there, I would be trapped between the locomotive and the concrete. I looked at the radiator fan housing behind me. It was a massive grill on top of the rear deck. If I could get the shutters open, the cooling fans might pull enough air through the rear to keep the engine alive, even if it was not the primary intake path. I crawled aft,
slipping on the icy steel. Davila, or the thing that used to be Davila, was on the roof. He moved with a horrifying, scuttling speed, using all 4 limbs. I stood up. I could not fight him on my knees. I raised the pipe wrench. He lunged. I stepped sideways, my boot catching a rivet. I slipped.
Davila hit me in the chest. Dead weight and hard ice. We went down hard on the dynamic brake blister. The air left my lungs. He was heavy, dense. Frozen meat is harder than living muscle. He snapped at my face, his teeth clacking together inches from my nose. The smell was unbearable, frozen bile and old blood. I jammed the handle of the wrench under his chin, pushing his head back. He clawed at my coat, the stiff fingers tearing at the Carhartt canvas. "Davila, get off!" I screamed, the logic of the old world overriding the reality of the new one. I could not throw him. He was locked onto me. I needed leverage. I bridged my back, heaving upward, and twisted my hips. We rolled. I ended up on top, pinning his arms with my knees. I raised the wrench. I did not want to do it. Davila had a wife. He liked the Dodgers. He made terrible coffee. I brought the heavy cast-iron head of the wrench down. Crunch. The skull gave way like a ceramic pot. The thing went limp instantly. I rolled off him, gasping for air, choking on the smoke. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm that drowned out the diesel. I looked down. More were coming. 3 of them were on the walkway now, moving toward the ladder. I grabbed the fusee from my pocket. I ripped the cap off and struck the igniter. Fzzz. A blinding red magnesium flare erupted, hissing violently. The light was searing, casting long, jagged shadows against the tunnel walls. I threw the flare. Not at the creatures. I threw it at the snow-packed intake on the far side. The flare lodged in the snowbank plastered against the grill. It burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow did not melt. It sublimated. A hole opened up instantly, steam exploding outward. The engine roared, a deep, throaty bellow as massive gulps of air rushed into the intake. The turbocharger whined, a high-pitched scream that climbed up the scale. The vibration under my feet smoothed out. The lights on the walkway brightened. Power. I looked at the creatures on the ladder. They recoiled from the intense red light and the sudden roar of the machine. They were photophobic, or maybe just confused by the sudden energy shift. Now, I grabbed Davila's corpse by the vest. I dragged him to the edge of the roof, right above the ladder. "Sorry, kid," I whispered. I shoved him over. He hit the climbers like a wrecking ball. The heavy, frozen body swept 3 of them off the ladder and back down into the mass below. I did not wait to see them land. I slid down the dynamic brake housing, jumped the last 4 feet to the walkway, and sprinted for the cab door. A hand grabbed my ankle. I fell forward, slamming my chin against the steel deck. I kicked backward, my boot connecting with something hard. The grip tightened. It was a vice. I rolled onto my back. One of them had reached through the railing gap. It was on the ground, but its arm was impossibly long, reaching up to snag me. I smashed the wrench down on the wrist. It shattered, but the fingers did not let go. The tendons were frozen tight. I dragged myself forward, pulling the creature up against the railing. I needed to cut the hand off. No time. I saw the steam pipe I had rigged earlier, the external overflow for the radiators. It was venting near the truck assembly. I hooked my other foot around the creature's forearm and pulled, dragging the arm toward the steam vent. The jet of 200-degree vapor hit the creature's face. It did not scream. The flesh just sloughed off, gray turning to pink, pink turning to bone. It convulsed,
the neural shock finally overriding the drive to feed. The hand loosened. I scrambled free, dove into the cab, and slammed the heavy steel door. I threw the deadbolt. I relooped the chain. I collapsed on the floor, my back against the metal, chest heaving. Outside, the flare sputtered and died. The darkness returned. But the engine was singing. It was a steady, powerful rhythm. Thrum, thrum, thrum. I checked the diagnostic screen. RPM 330, steady. Water temp 175. Battery charge plus 40 amps. I was alive. The machine was alive. But I was still starving. I looked at the manifest on the floor. Car 18. The frozen chicken. I could not go back out there, not now. The swarm was agitated.
They were swarming the locomotive, banging on the fuel tanks, scratching at the steel. I sat there for an hour, listening to them. The adrenaline faded, leaving a cold, trembling exhaustion. My hands were shaking so bad I could not unbutton my coat. I needed calories. If I did not eat, I would not have the strength to fight next time. And there would be a next time. I looked at the nose door, the internal door. The locomotive nose door leads to the front platform, but most modern units also have a low-level pass-through door that allows access to the adjacent unit in the consist without going outside, if the nose connections are open. I had 3 locomotives. Lead unit, mine. Unit 2, SD-70. Unit 3, GE Slave. Car 1 was a flat car loaded with lumber. If I could move through the locomotives internally, I could get to the 3rd unit. That put me 200 feet closer to the food. But to get from Unit 3 to Car 18, that was still 800 feet of open ground. Unless... I looked at the console. The independent brake handle. Locomotives have independent brakes for the engine only and automatic brakes for the whole train. The swarm was clustered around the lead unit. They were attracted to the heat and the noise here. If I moved the noise... I sat in the engineer's chair. I stared at the controls. Unit 3, I whispered. Remote setup. I keyed into the distributed power screen. I could control the trailing units independently. I could command Unit 3 to throttle up, make it scream, make it roar. If I notched Unit 3 up to notch 8, full power, while keeping the brakes applied, the engine would howl like a banshee. It would generate massive heat. It would vibrate the shed walls. It would be a dinner bell. I could draw them away, pull the swarm to the rear of the consist. But that would burn fuel, and it risked overheating Unit 3. I looked at my hands. The skin was paper thin. I was consuming my own muscle tissue. I did not have a choice. I tapped the screen. Unit 3, isolate. Unit 3, RPM set, notch 8. 200 feet behind me, the 3rd locomotive woke up. The turbocharger spooled up with a whine that cut through the shed. The engine roared to life, 4,400 horsepower straining against the brakes. The floor of my cab vibrated. I watched the rear camera monitor. It was grainy and dark, but I saw movement. The shadows near my cab were drifting away. They were moving toward the new noise, toward the heat. I waited 5 minutes. The sound from Unit 3 was deafening, a localized earthquake. I grabbed my grip. I emptied the tools. I needed space for meat. I took the pry bar. I took the flashlight. I opened the front nose door, not the rear. I stepped out onto the front platform of the lead unit. The coast was clear.
The swarm had migrated back. I did not go back. I went forward. I climbed down the nose ladder to the track bed. The snow was thigh-deep.
I slogged past the pilot plow. I was not going to walk to car 18. That was suicide. I looked at the signal box 10 yards ahead. A silver metal bungalow. Beside it, a maintenance speeder shed. Union Pacific keeps maintenance of way carts in these sheds for track inspectors. Hand cars. I smashed the lock on the shed with the pry bar. Inside, sitting on the rails, was a yellow motorized cart. A putt-putt. I checked the gas tank, half full. I looked back at the train. The third unit was screaming, drawing every monster in the county to the rear. I was not going to carry the chicken. I was going to drive to it. I pushed the cart out of the shed. The wheels squealed on the rails. I winced, but the roar of Unit 3 covered it. I pulled the starter cord. Nothing. I pulled again. Sputter. Third time. Pop, 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 pop. The little two-stroke engine caught. I jumped on. I engaged the gear. The cart jerked forward, moving away from the locomotive, deeper into the tunnel, toward the rear of the train. I was racing the swarm on a parallel track. I passed the lead unit. I passed Unit 2. I passed the screaming Unit 3. I saw them. A mass of gray bodies swarming the rear locomotive, climbing the trucks, biting the steel. They did not look at me. The noise of the diesel was a hypnotic shield. I throttled up the little cart. I flew past the lumber cars, the steel coil cars, the tanker. Car 18 loomed out of the dark. The white refrigerator car. I slammed the brakes on the cart. It skidded on the icy rails. I jumped off. I ran to the sliding door of the reefer. It was padlocked. I jammed the pry bar into the hasp. I threw my entire body weight against it. Snap! I slid the door open. A cloud of frozen vapor rolled out, smelling of raw poultry and cardboard. I climbed in. Floor-to-ceiling boxes. Tyson Foods. I grabbed a box. Heavy. 40 pounds. I threw it onto the cart. I grabbed another, and another. 10 boxes. 400 pounds of meat. I jumped back onto the cart. I looked back toward the engines. The noise of Unit 3 was sputtering. It was overheating. The computer was about to kill it. When Unit 3 died, the silence would return. And they would hear the pop, pop, pop of my cart. I slammed the cart into reverse. The little engine whined. "Come on!" I yelled. I raced backward, retracing the mile. The sound of Unit 3 died just as I passed the tanker car. The sudden silence was physical. I saw heads turn on the swarm pile. They saw me. I pinned the throttle. The cart rattled violently on the uneven track. They were coming. Not slow shuffles now. They were sprinting, a wave of gray motion flowing over the ballast. I reached the front of the locomotive consist. The lead unit was still idling quietly. I did not stop at the ladder. I kept the cart moving until I was practically under the nose of my engine. I threw the boxes off the cart into the snow. 1, 2, 3. The first runner hit the cart just as I grabbed the last box. It slammed into the metal side, teeth snapping at my boot. I kicked it in the face, feeling bone give way. I grabbed the rail of the nose ladder. I hauled the box up. I threw it onto the platform. I climbed. A hand grabbed my trailing leg. I did not look. I stopped. The heel of my boot drove into a wrist. It crunched. I pulled myself up onto the platform. I dragged the box inside the nose door. I slammed the door. I spun the wheel lock. Thud, thud, thud. They were beating on the steel. I collapsed in the nose compartment.
lying on a box of frozen chicken breasts. I was breathing so hard I thought my ribs would crack. I dragged the box into the cab. I ripped the cardboard open. I took a frozen, rock-hard breast. I held it against the heater vent until the surface softened just enough. I bit into it. Raw, cold. It tasted like life. I looked at the diagnostics. Unit 3 was dead. Unit 2 was offline. My lead unit was the last heart beating. But I had 400 pounds of food. I had water. I had heat. I looked at the duct tape on the window. It was peeling. I was not just a squatter anymore. I was the master of this vessel. And I had just robbed the grave to feed the engine. Time stopped being a sequence of hours and became a measurement of volume. I did not look at a clock to know when to sleep. I looked at the sight glass on the fuel tank.
I did not check a calendar to know the date. I checked the height of the chicken box stack in the nose compartment. My universe had contracted to a steel tube, 10 feet wide and 80 feet long. The lead locomotive, UP-8404, was no longer a vehicle. It was a biosphere, a lung that breathed diesel and exhaled heat. And like any organ, it required constant, invasive surgery to keep beating. The routine was absolute. It was the only thing that separated me from the gray, shuffling things outside. I woke up. The vibration of the V12 was the baseline of my existence. If it stopped, I died. That was the first rule of the New World. I sat up in the engineer's seat, which I had padded with acoustic foam torn from the ceiling of the dead second unit. The foam smelled of old dust and mildew, but it stopped the seat springs from digging into my spine. First task, the gauge sweep. Water temp, 178 degrees. Perfect. Oil pressure, 28 psi. A little low, suggesting the filters were getting clogged with soot. I made a note on the wall with a grease pencil. Battery voltage, 74 volts. I stood up and stretched. My joints popped like dry twigs. The air in the cab was warm, humidified by the bubbling trash can radiator, but it carried a permanent, heavy scent. A mix of diesel fumes, unwashed human, and the faint, sweet smell of the thawing chicken breasts I kept near the heater vent. I walked to the nose door, the pantry. I had dragged the frozen boxes from the platform inside, stacking them against the bulkhead. I took one breast, rock hard, pale pink. I placed it in a small aluminum tray I had fashioned from a piece of flashing. I set the tray on top of the copper coil loop in the water bin. Sous vide, railroad style. It would take 2 hours to cook to a safe temperature. Hygiene came next. I could not afford to waste water on a full shower, but I had established a bird bath routine. I dipped a rag into the hot water bin and scrubbed the critical areas: face, pits, groin, feet. Especially the feet. Trench foot was a quiet killer. I dried my socks on the heater vent, rotating 3 pairs. Then, the work began. The locomotive was burning roughly 4 gallons of diesel an hour to maintain high idle and keep the systems charged. That was nearly 100 gallons a day. The belly tank of my lead unit held 5,000 gallons, but I had been running for weeks. The needle was dropping toward the halfway mark. I had fuel, but it was in the wrong tanks. Unit 2 and Unit 3, the dead locomotives behind me, were sitting on 10,000 gallons of pristine diesel. But without power, their transfer pumps were dead bricks. I had to be the pump. I prepped for the EVA, coveralls over jeans, duct tape around the wrists and ankles, the pipe wrench in a belt loop, the flashlight. I unlocked the rear door. The chain rattled, a sound that always made my pulse spike. I peered through the peephole. The shed was quiet. The massacre of the roof had happened 3 weeks ago? 4? I had lost track. Since then, the swarm had mostly dispersed, wandering back into the dark tunnels or freezing solid in the drifts. The bodies of the ones I had killed were still there, piled near the tracks, dusted with snow. They were statues now, gray lumps that I had learned to ignore. I stepped out. The cold was still sharp, but it had lost its biting edge. The deep freeze of winter was softening. I walked the walkway to Unit 2. The dead locomotive was a tomb. It was freezing inside, the silence absolute. I moved to the engine room, my breath pluming in the flashlight beam. I had built a umbilical system. It was my magnum opus of scavenging. I had stripped the fuel lift pump from the auxiliary rack of Unit 2. It was a heavy, cast-iron unit, DC-powered. I had mounted it on a piece of plywood and fitted it with hoses scavenged from the air brake lines. The challenge was power. The pump ran on 74 volts DC. I had cannibalized a set of heavy-gauge jumper cables, stolen from the battery box of Unit 3, and spliced them into a 100-foot extension cord made from Romex wire I'd ripped out of the tunnel lighting conduits. I dragged the pump assembly to the fuel filler neck of Unit 2. I dropped the suction hose into the tank. The diesel inside was thick, like syrup, gelled by the cold. I dragged the discharge hose across the coupling, over the gap, and into the filler neck of my lead unit. Then came the dangerous part. I ran the power cable back to my cab, to the electrical cabinet. I had installed a kill switch, a heavy industrial breaker I'd found in the nose kit. "Contact," I whispered. I threw the breaker. Whirr, the pump motor screamed. It was not designed for this load or this temperature. I watched the clear plastic section of the hose I'd spliced in. A dark slug of fuel shot through, followed by a steady stream. I walked back to the gap between the engines to monitor the line. The hose pulsed like a living artery. I was transfusing blood from a corpse to a survivor. I stood there for an hour, watching the fuel move. This was the work. Not fighting monsters, not running for my life. Just watching fluids move through tubes, monitoring pressures, ensuring the vibration did not chafe a hole in the rubber. Survival is 99% maintenance. While the fuel transferred, I checked the physical plant. I walked around the lead unit, inspecting the trucks. I checked the brake shoes. They were frozen to the wheels. That was fine. I was not moving. I checked the sanders. The sandhoppers were full. If I ever needed traction on icy rails, I had it. I stopped at the pilot plow, the front of the train. I looked out into the tunnel ahead. The snowdrift that had blocked us was still there, a white wall between the pillars. But it looked different. The surface was glazed, shiny. It had melted and refrozen. Winter was breaking. I returned to the cab, killed the pump, and coiled the cables. I checked the fuel gauge. Full. I had bought another month of life. I ate the chicken breast for lunch. It was stringy and tasted faintly of copper from the water, but it was protein. I washed it down with hot water. Then, I sat in the engineer's chair and looked at the wall. I had turned the conductor's side of the cab into a map room. I had used a Sharpie to draw a schematic of the pass on the gray metal wall. Truckee, east, 12 miles. Colfax, west, 40 miles. The summit. You are here. I had marked the known threats. Shed 47, the nest. Rear of train, the dead zone. And then there was the radio code. I had not heard the loop south clear signal in 2 weeks. The silence was worse than the static. Had the battery died? Had the person transmitting it been overrun? Or had they moved on?
I spent hours staring at that scribble on the wall. Loop south. If they were at the Truckee Loop, they were downhill. Gravity was on my side. If I released the brakes, 8404 would roll. I would not even need the engine for traction, only for air brakes. But rolling meant leaving the shed, leaving the fortress. Not yet, I said to the empty cab. The track is still fouled.
I picked up the radio handset. I did not transmit. I just held it, the plastic warm in my hand. It was a talisman. As long as the radio worked, I was not the last man on Earth. I was just the last man here. The change happened in the 3rd month. I woke up to a new sound. It was not the wind. It was not the engine. Drip, drip, drip. I sat up. Water was hitting the metal floor of the cab near the nose door. I went to the window. The ice on the glass was gone. Outside, the world was no longer white and gray. It was wet. The snow melt had begun. In the mountains, spring is not a gentle awakening. It's a violent hydraulic event. The millions of tons of snow packing the shed roof were turning into water. The concrete roof of Shed 47, cracked and aged, was leaking like a sieve. Water was cascading down the shed pillars. It was pooling on the tracks. I opened the door. The air did not bite my face. It smelled of wet concrete, ozone, and rot. The deep freeze had preserved the bodies outside. Now, the thaw was releasing them. The smell hit me like a physical blow, a wave of decomposition rolling into the cab. Damn it, I choked, pulling my collar up over my nose. I looked down at the track bed. The water was rising. The ballast was submerged. This was a new problem. The traction motors, the electric motors that drive the wheels, hang low on the axles. They are sealed, but they are not submarines. If the water rose high enough to submerge the intakes, I would ground out the electrical system. Short circuit. Flashover. Dead locomotive. I could not stay here. The fortress was becoming a swamp. I spent the next 2 days in a frenzy of waterproofing. I used the last of the duct tape to seal the conduit entries on the truck frames. I cut up heavy rubber floor mats and zip-tied them over the motor blowers. But the water kept rising. The drainage culverts in the tunnel were blocked by debris and silt. The shed was turning into a canal. I sat in the chair, watching the water lap at the bottom step of the ladder. The choice was no longer theoretical. If I stayed, the water would kill the engine. The silence would come. Then the cold. Then the hunger. If I moved, I risked derailment. I risked running into a blocked track. I risked the unknown. But the machine was meant to move. A locomotive at rest is a dying thing. It rots from the inside out. Seals dry up. Bearings seize. It needs to roll. I looked at the fuel gauge. Full. I looked at the air pressure. 90 psi. I looked at the map on the wall. Loop south clear. Maybe it was not a status report. Maybe it was an invitation. I stood up. I did not pack a bag. I lived in the bag. I walked to the nose compartment. I checked the cow catcher, the pilot plow. It was heavy steel, designed to push snow and debris. It could handle a 5-foot drift if I hit it with momentum. But I had 3 locomotives and 20 cars. That was 6,000 tons of inertia. I needed to shed the weight. I could not drag the whole train. The drag from the frozen bearings on the rear cars would be too much.
I needed to cut the consist. I grabbed the uncoupling lever bar, a heavy steel rod used to manually operate the couplers. I walked back to the gap between Unit 1 and Unit 2. The water was ankle-deep on the walkway. The smell of the thawing dead was atrocious. I gagged, my eyes watering. I looked at the connection between my lead unit and the dead weight behind it. I closed the angle cots on the airlines. I disconnected the MU multiple unit cables. I disconnected the power cables. My lead unit was now isolated. Just one engine, one brain, one survivor. I grabbed the cutting lever. It was rusted stiff. "Come on," I grunted. I kicked the lever. Clang! The pin dropped. The knuckle opened. I was free. I climbed back into the cab. It felt different now. Lighter. The connection to the dead past was severed. I sat in the engineer's seat. I put my hands on the controls. They felt natural. Extensions of my nervous system. I released the independent brake. The shoes hissed as they pulled away from the steel wheels. I reached for the reverser handle. I inserted it into the slot. Forward. I looked at the throttle. I did not mash it. You do not mash the throttle on a GE. You coax it. I moved the handle to notch 1.
The engine RPMs did not change much, but the load meter jumped. The alternator was dumping current into the traction motors. Magnetic fields were building. Steel gears were biting into steel teeth. Groan. The locomotive shuddered. The wheels slipped a fraction of an inch on the wet rail, then bit. Clank. We moved. It was imperceptible at first, just a shift in the vibration. Then, the pillar next to the window moved. I was moving. I held my breath. The noise was incredible, the squeal of rusted flanges, the groan of the suspension waking up from a 3-month coma. I nudged it to notch 2. The engine bellowed. The turbo whistled. We picked up speed. 2 miles per hour. 3. I approached the white wall of the snowdrift ahead, the blockage that had trapped us. I did not slow down. I could not. I needed momentum. "Hold together," I whispered. I braced myself against the console. Wham! The impact threw me forward against the glass. The locomotive shuddered violently. The cab went dark as snow buried the windows. The wheels spun. The wheel slip light flashed frantically on the dash. I did not cut the power. I dumped sand. I kept the throttle at notch 2. Grind, push, heave. The 400,000-pound machine fought the mountain. It was a wrestling match between diesel torque and frozen water. And then, light. The plow broke through. The snow shattered. The cab burst out of the drift and into gray. Not the dark gray of the tunnel. The bright, blinding gray of a foggy mountain morning. I was out of the shed. I cut the throttle to idle. The locomotive coasted, heavy and unstoppable. Below me, the mountain dropped away into the mist. I could see the tops of pine trees. I could see the curve of the track winding down toward the valley. The track ahead was covered in snow, but it was not blocked. The wind had scoured the rails on the exposed ridges. I looked back. Shed 47 sat like a concrete scar on the mountainside. Dark, silent. A tomb for the train, for the bodies, and for the man I used to be. I checked the mirror. No smoke from the rear, no sparks. Just the lead unit, running light, running free. I picked up the radio handset. I dialed in the frequency, channel 14.
I keyed the mic. My thumb trembled just once. "Loop south," I said, my voice raspy, unused to speaking to anything but a machine. "This is UP-8404. I am coming down the hill. Clear the line." I did not wait for an answer. I did not need one. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the wrapper of the gum I had saved from that first night. I smoothed it out and stuck it to the console. A memento. I moved the throttle to notch 1. The train began to roll, picking up speed as gravity took hold. I was not a survivor anymore. I was an engineer. And I had a schedule to keep.